Good evening. I'd like to welcome everybody watching to our Friday night live webcast from LaRouchepack.com. My name is Matthew Ogden, and today is May 9th, 2014. We're joined, as we always are, by Mr. Lyndon LaRouche, and I'm also joined in the studio tonight by Jason Ross, part of our Basement Scientific Research team. Now, we're going to start tonight's broadcast with our institutional question, which reads as follows. Now that the House has finally established a select committee to probe the 2012 Benghazi attacks, what should be the criteria, scope, and actions of that panel?
Obama's career may not be long-lasting. What has happened finally is that Obama is now implicitly in charge with covering up and falsely making false statements respecting what happened in Benghazi in the conspiracy to assassinate members of the team of the United States. Now, everyone in the process knew it and denied it, including Obama himself. And so, therefore, Obama has sustained a lie, a denial concerning the planned murder of an official of the United States in the Benghazi affair. In other words, he could be sent not only to impeachment, but to other indictments, much more severe, because they very specific and aggravated falsification of an intentional murder by conspiracy of officials of the United States government is a capital felony. And even presidents are not exempt from capital penalties of that sort. Now, this is only one very crucial event in the course of a pileup of many prospective indictments of the Obama administration, not the entirety of the administration, but a number of key figures in the administration who have committed and participated in crimes of this nature. Now, what's happening in process is that there's a process of delay coming from CIA and other circles who are trying to slow down the process of uncovering of the evidence. It comes down to criminal evidence against the President of the United States and circles associated with him. So this means that he's on a short pitch. It also means something else. Obama is not controlling the conflict against Russia. He's only a stooge of the British. Now, this operation has two stages, and the whole issue of the charges against Obama coincide with this. The charges on this question about this particular incident. Obama was only the stooge. Now, often in warfare, in major warfare, particularly when an empire like the British Empire is involved, some part or agent of the British Empire, or agency, for example, when 9/11 was done as a British operation against the United States, part of the British operations against the United States, which is actually tantamount to a state of war. But what happened is the British, who controlled the financing of the entire operation of 9/11, used the Saudis, who are nothing but subjects of the British Empire, in order to set up the 9/11 operation. Both the Bush family, the Bush administration, meaning Cheney, and also Bush as himself, but he's only a slob. He's not mentally all there. It never has been. But also Obama, again, a slob. He's not an intelligent person. He hires witches to do his work for him, male and female witches, like this Newland creature, who's a Cheney witch that whipped up from something or other. It means like one of these monsters of the witches. So therefore, it's a complicated process, but what the logic is, if you understand the principles of strategy in major warfare, first of all, the British Empire is an empire. It is not a kingdom. And the entire apparatus. The United States is also a victim of the British Empire, especially when you come to Wall Street. Wall Street is historically a British agent, a treasonous British agent operating inside the United States. This goes back to a British assassination against the former Secretary of State of the United States, who was assassinated by a British agent. And there have been many assassinations of presidents in the United States and of other figures by British agencies. Abraham Lincoln was assassinated by the British Empire, personally. So we've come to a point that the real enemy here is the British Empire. The other thing is to understand why the war, the threat of war is going on now. The threat of war is not a threat of a war between Russia and somebody in Europe. The threat of war is a threat of a thermonuclear war launched as the last step desperation measure of the British Empire. What is about to happen is the economic system of the transatlantic region, from the United States, the transatlantic region as a whole, from London itself. That whole system has been going through a hyperinflationary process in recent times, especially since the repeal of Glass-Steagall. The repeal of Glass-Steagall set into motion a hyperinflationary mechanism which has drained down the public of the United States, drained down our economy for a period of time, now approaching 16 years. So therefore, the time has come that the hyperinflation, which was the bailout system of that whole period, the bailout system has now gone into a hyperinflationary picture. In other words, the real physical economy of the United States is dead. Whole categories of employment are wiped out. Whole categories of people who lost their jobs or never got them are dying. Most of the young people, youngest generation of people who are in the employment area today are starving. They have no opportunities. For example, the weather system. We don't have weathermen anymore to speak of. You are running around in bad weather with no weatherman to speak of because you didn't hire them. Now, you get a student who graduates from a university process and gets into a $50,000 a year kind of expense, for that career. And they're not hired. So the weatherman is not there. You don't even know what the weather is because the number of people who can follow these stations, which are the weather stations, are diminishing. They're vanishing. The similar thing with all other kinds of careers of government officials. They're being depleted. The job is being cut out. The service is lacking. Medical care is lacking because of reforms in the medical system. We don't give people medical care anymore. You have a visitor who comes in as an official, and he, the official, does the work. But he's not the visiting doctor. He's not the physician on the job. He's not the resource that people go to in the community for medical care and the institutions of medical care. This is now an entirely Wall Street controlled activity. Medicine has become a Wall Street trading operation. So we now come to the point that the whole system, the whole European system in the main part, and also the American system, the transatlantic system, is now headed toward a general breakdown collapse if any effort is continued to maintain the Wall Street British system. Only if we get rid of Obama, who is only a nuisance, he's expendable already, because he's not been able to deal with the game they were trying to play with Putin. They were trying to play a preliminary nibble process against Russia. The idea that they'd harass him, they would cause him to make mistakes, so forth, create a confusion, and it didn't work. It backfired. Germany, for example, in the large part, is totally opposed to this operation. Other parts of Europe are coming into the same focus. So Obama is about to be finished. On the one hand, he'll be discarded to protect the British Empire, and because he's no longer useful to them. Get rid of the garbage. But the plan is, on the British Empire part, is to go a full-throated thermonuclear attack on the world in general. The purpose of the British Empire has always been stated recently to be the reduction of the human population. That has been the policy of the Queen. That's the policy of her chief agent, her son, is mass murder throughout the world to reduce the population from what it had been recently, 7 billion people, to less than 1. That's why that's where the green policy is. The green policy is a systemic policy created by the British Empire, by the British Queen herself, and that's all on the record. And the record is to reduce the population of human beings on this planet. Now, this was done by the British Roman Empire, not quite on that method. That's the sole system, the ancient system of Zeus. Reduce the ordinary population to a relative handful of survivors, as was done in the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire killed off its own population to reduce it. And the families which had wealth would take their gold and silver and goodies and so forth, and they went up to the north of the Adriatic Sea and lived for a while largely in a swamp and came back as the Venetian system. And this is the kind of, you're dealing with the Zeusian system, as it's called, the oligarchical system. The British Empire is the last major force of the oligarchical system. It's now dying because it's going bankrupt. All of the great assets of the British Empire, all the great assets of Wall Street, are in the greatest part worthless. It's totally bankrupt. Now, there are banks in the United States which are still functioning. These were traditional banks which bought their way into cooperation with Wall Street. That they were always connected to Wall Street, but you have to look at the great gambling feature of the Wall Street operation. And it's that great gambling, that quick turnaround, fast turnaround. And that hyperinflation, which has come out of the Wall Street system and out of London for the rest of the world, has created a situation in which the transatlantic world, the transatlantic economy, can no longer live with a full-throated population under these conditions. The policy of genocide is the policy of the British Empire against the American people as against others. Anybody who supports Wall Street is an enemy of the human species, an enemy of the people of the United States. So that's what the real danger is. All of this stuff, the rest of the stuff, is dog and pony show.
Now, Lynn, I got to read a preliminary release of your new paper, History is Closing In on Obama. And one of the things you emphasized, and you've repeatedly emphasized this, is that the so-called World War I, which nominally began in 1914, 100 years ago, actually began in 1890 with the ouster of Bismarck, and that a series of smaller wars were unleashed to merely set up the preconditions for the launching of World War I, which in fact never ended. There was merely a pause, and then this was renewed under the name of World War II. Now, today, the 9th of May, is Victory Day. It's celebrating the end of World War II, 69 years ago. And there were massive military parades across Russia. There was a military parade in Moscow, which was attended by President Putin, who then proceeded on to pay a special visit to Sevastopol in Crimea, where he oversaw a formation of the Black Sea Fleet coming into the harbor there. And this was to mark the anniversary of the signing of the Articles of Capitulation by the Nazis, marking their official surrender to the Soviet Red Army in Berlin in 1945 and the end of the Great Patriotic War, as it's called. And the day serves as a remembrance of the 27 million Soviet citizens who died in the cause of defeating fascism. Now, obviously, these celebrations are occurring in the context of the Kiev coup, which were perpetrated by what you could call the Newland Nazis. And we're now seeing fighting and bloodshed spreading across eastern Ukraine, marked by the massacre last week in Odessa, where over 40 people were burned alive in the trade union building there by right sector fascists. And the speaker of the Russian Duma called this genocide. And leading Russian officials are continuing to make statements making very clear that they see that the threat of fascism is still a very real threat. The defense minister, Shoigu, for example, said that this year's Victory Day celebrations have particular importance to demonstrate to the world that Russia has zero tolerance for fascism. And Vladimir Putin gave a speech yesterday after overseeing major military drills involving Russia's nuclear strike aerospace defense systems and a test launch of a Russian strategic nuclear ICBM. And he said this is critical to maintaining the sovereignty of Russia, and then warned of the danger that militant nationalism is again rearing its head, the same kind that brought on the appearance of Nazi ideology. So it's clear that the threat of thermonuclear war is as dangerous as ever. Now, earlier this week, you released a statement which we discussed as, "It's the British Empire, stupid." And you made this point in your opening remarks, but I kind of want to come back to it. In this new paper, History is Closing in on Obama, you state that it would be a severe strategic miscalculation to ignore the fact that it's the British Empire that's responsible for provoking this thermonuclear war, and to assume that Obama is anything but a stooge for the British intention. And you say this: "The de facto British puppet of today, U.S. President Barack Obama, has been merely the assigned, merely nominal protagonist, representing the British imperial intention to attempt to launch a provocation for thermonuclear world system of warfare at this present time. The currently attempted British imperial taunting of Russia by use of the traditional Hitler-Nazi organization, which had already been planted by Adolf Hitler himself in the Ukraine, has only been a pre-World War taunt set into motion by a mere British stooge and miserable wretch, U.S. President Barack Obama. A pre-stage to a new version of those preliminary wars, the so-called Balkan Wars, used to set up World War I. The British Empire is simply using its stooge, Obama, to assemble the forces for a planet-wide World War III." Now, your unique insight into the beginning of World War I, and really the beginning of this entire century of warfare, beginning in 1890, roughly, but sets you apart from anybody else who considers them a historian or a strategist. I'd like you to give us an insight into your idea of strategy, which allows you to have this insight.
Well, first of all, actually, the World War system began with the assassination of Lincoln. Now, what happened was, Lincoln was assassinated by the British. So the continuity is perfect. The British Empire from that time, from the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, which it did in its own name. So therefore, anybody who attacks Lincoln's regime, Lincoln's program, is a traitor to the United States. But look at the number of people who were part of the Confederate tradition who came into play. What presidents of the United States were assassinated and which were not? You will find that, for example, with the assassination of a president in the 1890s, going to the century, you got then. Now, in the middle of this, the British Empire moved to get Bismarck, the Chancellor of Germany, out of power. It was done by the British monarchy as such. Once that happened, the President of France was next assassinated. The assassination of President Carnot of France set into motion a process of chaos in France and coincided with the launching of a series of wars, of regional wars in various parts of the world, including Asia, beginning in the early part of the 1890s. This continued to several processes, including wars, until 1914. So the war started then, and it started as a part of an imperial action trying to destroy the United States utterly and to crush all Europe and to conduct a policy to conquer the world. So the purpose of this was to establish this solid control of a world empire over the entire world population. Now that's what the issue is. So today when you're talking about Wall Street, you are not talking about everybody in Wall Street, but you're talking about the institution of Wall Street has been since the Manhattan Organization of the Dutch bankers and others, who were the responsible powers behind the British action to assassinate the Secretary of Treasury of the United States, Alexander Hamilton. The Hamilton extraction and the corruption of the United States into accepting state-by-state policies, state sovereignty, as against the new nation's sovereignty, trapped the United States into blocking the constitutional provision of no state in the United States has the right to set economic policy contrary to the national economic policy. The fact that you had presidents of the United States after George Washington until President Monroe, and all these presidents committed a treasonous action in violating the article of the Constitution, which demanded the prescription of a single system of economic policy of the United States. And they went to the idea of the states' rights issue. As a result of the states' rights issue, most of the presidents of the United States were either traitors to the United States or opportunist fools. Only a few presidents were actually fit to be president. And if you look down the list of those presidents who were assassinated, you'll find they were the honest presidents.
Well, to bring in another personality from that time period, I had a question for you about culture. To follow up on what you just brought up now and what you've been bringing up in your speaking and writing quite a bit recently about two events around the turn of the 20th century. The 1900 International Congress of Mathematicians in Paris, which was the beginning of Hilbert and Russell's actions to axiomatize mathematics and destroy science, which continues to have a deadly effect on the ability to make new discoveries. And second, the ouster of Bismarck, which you just spoke about. I'd like to ask you about Johannes Brahms, whose 181st birthday we're celebrating this week, and whose 1897 death marked the end of a defense and progress of classical culture against the irrationalism and degradation of Liszt, Wagner, Strauss. The destruction of the notion of truthful beauty and that severing of humanity from an emotional connection to a developing world in which we belong, that fed into politics, into culture, into science as well. Now, the recent Schiller Institute performances of the Mozart Requiem in honor of John Kennedy, those were major interventions into this cultural environment. So the question I'd like to ask you is, how does the death of Brahms fit into this shift at the turn of the 20th century? And to what extent must a cultural revolution be a part of the overall sea change of affairs we need to end empire for good?
Good. Well, first of all, the issue has been always, as far as we know, the history of mankind. I mean, we know of a prehistory of mankind, and that's a complicated question as well. But in what we might call the history of mankind, which comes from the legendary Zeus as one force, which is the force of pure evil, you have a history of mankind which goes through various kinds of developments of culture. What you can track in this thing is the fact there is a tendency of division of culture to what you may consider actually human in its orientation, as opposed to people who are predatory. In other words, you have two kinds of culture. You have the predatory culture. We don't like somebody, we eat them, or something to that term. And you kill off the people you don't like, or you make slaves of them. So the history of human slavery as a systemic feature of European civilization and so forth is the mark of a force of evil, which is called the Zeusian principle. It's the principle of oligarchism, as it's otherwise called. All right? So the Roman Empire was a sort of evil from the beginning. It was inherently evil. The British Empire, which was built on the model of the Roman Empire explicitly, on the decline and fall of the Roman Empire, that was the policy which established the Roman Empire as the British Empire as such. So these are forces of evil. The Dutch role in the terms of the 15th and 16th century is also part of that evil. What happened to the Massachusetts Bay Colony? It was the Dutch that shut down the Massachusetts Bay Colony and crippled the formation of the United States for a long period of time. We had to go through almost a century to get the United States, or what was the American settlement, back in. So that's the general landscape you're dealing with. Now, what's happened is there was a process in the totality of history, which is unique, which is the formation of the Great Reform of Venice, post-Venice. And this was led by people, such as Brunelleschi, who was one of the great scientists of that period, and he was actually a founder of modern science. Cardinal Nicholas of Cusa was an actual founder of physical science. And Kepler himself put a conclusion on the efforts of both the previous two, which created modern science, typified by, our greatest scientists. So therefore you had a war going on between the imperial tendency, which is typified by the ancient systems of that type, and a struggle coming out of the Renaissance period to achieve a new form. The breakthrough had come as a result of the Renaissance, because a fellow called Christopher Columbus was converted into becoming an advocate of a policy of crossing the ocean, given to him by the circles of Nicholas of Cusa, who had been the great intellectual leader of the Renaissance. So what happened was the influence of the American settlements, especially those in North America, out of what came out of Columbus, and reached a very strong form, a successful form, in the area of New England. This influenced the entire world. Actually, the advent of science in Europe as a systemic progress came as a result of this process of the Renaissance. So therefore, there was a turn in the direction of history. Since that time, the whole process has been an attempt to crush that out of, to go to a purely Zeusian, purely oligarchical form. The form today that oligarchical system represents is called the British Empire. What's happened ever since, because of what happened in the defeat of the right to introduction of states' rights into the American system, destroyed the ability of the American Revolution to sustain its purpose. We had people in the United States who would defend this and did an excellent job in doing it. They often were killed in the process of doing that. Most of the assassinations of presidents were done by the British Empire. Like Abraham Lincoln. You could go through the whole list. Well, the two brothers, John and Robert Kennedy, were assassinated because of that reason. And you find that politics in the United States has been dominated by what we call the oligarchical tradition. The Wall Street money bags, who are representatives of London, or actually agents of London, have been the directing force in crushing and corrupting our United States. So they have an empire out there. And what's happened, we've reached the point now where the decline of the British Empire, remember the British Empire is now totally bankrupt. There's no way that its money system can be sustained. What it's doing now is what was done by the Roman Empire. Kill the people. Reduce the population. Kill the people. And try to control a smaller population in a more local region. That's what happened to the Roman Empire. The Roman tradition still exists as a Roman tradition, as fully evil as Rome was, as ancient Rome. The Venetian system was pure evil, the product of the Roman system. And the Venetian system still is like a Wall Street inside Europe. So this is the process of history. So the struggle here is to recognize that there is a nature of mankind which is good, and there's a contrary nature of mankind which is evil. And in between, there's a lot of confusion. Yeah? But what happened is in creating the Americas, creating in the United States, was a product of the effects of the Renaissance, of the great Renaissance, which was the rebirth of humanity. And it was this Renaissance which, even while being crushed by British and other influences of that time, was able to create a new nation in North America, which went through struggles, defeats, recoveries. But then the enemy, the oligarchical enemy, centered in the British Empire, was able to kill and confuse American leaders. And the problem was that those few great American leaders, like Benjamin Franklin, on whom the whole achievement of the actual Constitution depended, both for science and for other considerations. And geniuses like, I could name a whole bunch of them, who actually contributed to this process, such as Alexander Hamilton, who's one of the greatest geniuses in economy. Hamilton today, is actually the emblematic greatest genius of economy on this planet. Now, I'm completely familiar with his genius, and I can defend it and prove it against any damn fool who wants to come up against me. But the fact is, what we have to do and recognize, we have to have a mission. You can't merely attack bad things. You've got to bring in good things, not to attack bad things. And we have to reestablish, first of all, eliminate Wall Street. Yeah? Eliminate administrations like the Obama administration or the Bush-Cheney administration. Eliminate them. They've caused all the greatest evil in the past 16 to 18 years on this planet from us. Get rid of these guys. Put them off in a cave someplace or some desert island or something like that. Get them out of here. They don't bathe well. Whatever is wrong with them, it's wrong. So therefore, we should have a mission. Our mission, knowing that the transatlantic region of the planet, in any case, is finished in its present form. The transatlantic world is so corrupted that in its present form it cannot survive. The only hope of survival comes in the Eurasian section of the world. That doesn't mean the United States will be dead or that Western Europe will be dead. But it means they're crippled. They're culturally crippled. They don't have the cultural capabilities of restoring the kinds of achievement that many of them had earlier. The recent period, since the assassination of the Kennedy brothers, the United States has been on a steady downward trend in culture, in economy, in everything. So you have almost everybody who I used to know is dead. And what remains are the people who are still living, but who don't have the ability that those who had died had once represented. So we have to have a leadership in the transatlantic region, a revival of the transatlantic region to the true original purpose of the transatlantic discovery and development. We have to do that realizing that there's no longer a possibility of general war throughout the planet. General war throughout the planet would be thermonuclear war. Not nuclear war, thermonuclear war. Nuclear war is not a possible alternative. Thermonuclear war. And thermonuclear war fought among a generality of nations on this planet is human extermination warfare, because the effects of thermonuclear warfare are of that nature. Therefore, we have to come to an understanding, an accommodation among nations, at least among the viable nations, who are not the fruitcakes and nutworks and mass killers of society. We have to form a series of understandings among sovereign nations, because you cannot organize society effectively except through sovereign peoples, people who have a sense of a sovereign community. So you want to take the sovereign communities of the planet, or what should be the sovereign communities, and create a system of cooperation, because we are now coming to a point where the future is largely lies not in space, but in mankind's ability to cope with the challenge of nearby space. For example, we are threatened immediately. We don't know when, but sometime not so distant. If we don't fix something, that some satellite is going to come roaming in our direction and actually not miss hitting Earth head on. Such a satellite encounter on Earth would exterminate the human species. Therefore, we have in the threat of extermination of the human species by this kind of lackadaisical attitude, we have bought into ourselves a loss of the preventive capability which, under the conditions we know, under terms of modern science, we could prevent such things from happening. So therefore we have a mission, a new mission of humanity, for a community of nations or national groupings who operate on the basis of their own culture by which they best understand themselves. Bring these nations together in a system of correspondence, because warfare as we have generally known it is no longer possible. Therefore we have to bring the planet and its system into order. And without that, there's not much hope for the future of mankind. The time for doing this is about right now.
All right, so we have a question from Keisha Rogers, who I'm sure has plenty of experience battling states' writers down there in Texas. Keisha Rogers is the candidate for United States Senate in the state of Texas, running as a Democrat, and the runoff election is coming up 2 weeks from this coming Tuesday. Now, her question is the following. Hi, Lynn. As I have traveled all over Texas with my Senate campaign, I'm now currently in South Texas, it is very apparent that we are dealing with a population which has been beaten down by a slave mentality stemmed from continuing to reside on the Bush plantation, and caught up in thinking that only local solutions can solve the crisis and the problems that we face, such as the devastating drought hitting Texas, unemployment, and food shortages, to name a few. Throughout all of my discussions with the population, with news media, and with different political groups throughout the state, I have strongly taken on the states' rights mentality, and also so-called local solutions, as a failure. And I have challenged people to think big. We need a national mission, a real science driver mission for the country. So my question to you is, how do we continue to free people from this slave mentality perpetuated by a lying media and a political system that has beaten the population to despair, and get them to contemplate ideas and solutions of national interest? How do we get people to free themselves from the enslavement that forces them to continue to capitulate to no good political candidates that go against their true interest?
There's a certain kind of complication to addressing that kind of problem, because you're talking about the willing and the able, as opposed to those who are simply going along to get along. Now, we've reached a point, as in Texas, and is being hit us in California, is hit in most of the southerly states of the United States, that there is a drought in process which is going to, on the basis of all available forecasting, is going to continue through several generations or longer, in which, in the course of what is the trend now, you will find that Texas and most of those other states, including California, in most of the areas of those states, there will no longer be people living. The water systems will be dead. The areas of habitation will be deserts. The sources of food supply will be nil. And therefore, we face this greatest threat, which is a natural catastrophe from the cyclical behavior of the sun itself, which has gone on one of its bad terms, as far as we're concerned. We're not getting the water supply anymore. We are going to have to mobilize the United States and others into creating a system of water management, which enables us to take some of the water that's flying around in the upper areas of the atmosphere and directing the flow of that water, in part, through areas in which rainfall would be deposited. Now, we had a program we worked on in recent decades, and the program was called NWAPA, the North American Water and Energy Supplies. And that would have worked. It was one which involved Alaska and Canada, and also the southern states. Now, the division of labor was between producing water and growing food. If you on the northern hemisphere, part of this hemisphere, northern side, you can get water, but you can't grow food without water. If we have water in the southern area, and we have seeds, which we raise, then the seeds will actually cause a growth of an irrigated territory, and you'll get food again, as in the recent times, the recent history, in Texas and in California and in other relevant states in the southern part of the west of the United States. This is the only solution for now, because the desiccation of the state of Texas, the state of California, and other states has reached a point it's going to accelerate. Things are going to become very much worse very, very fast. Now, if we are now faced with a problem, which is a very clear problem, but with an uncertain cure, our job is to have a mobilization of several varieties in order to increase the irrigation of the potential croplands and so forth, to shut down all fracking immediately. You want to save the United States, the first thing you must do, you must shut down all fracking inside the territory of the United States and northern Mexico. You must do that. Otherwise, you're going to get problems that you cannot possibly deal with. No more fracking. Shut it down now. I don't care what the agreements are. Shut it down. And no fracking being used either in Europe, either. Fracking is a very stupid thing. It's you know what fracking came in as? Fracking came in as a proposed alternative to thermonuclear power. If we go back to thermonuclear power, we don't have any fracking challenge. What we have to do, but we've got a problem also with our scientific community. That since what happened at the beginning of the 20th century, we moved to cancel science, to eliminate science in favor of what? mathematics. So you have people out there today who are called scientists who are not, they're trying to practice science, but they don't have competence in science as such. They have competence in things they're trained to do. Mechanical procedures, mathematical procedures with machines, computers. But a computer has no intelligence. Intelligence lies only in human existence, in the human mind. And the human mind's function is actually the noetic powers of the human mind. It's in chemistry. That is, mankind is different than any other animal. Mankind is not an animal, in fact. The human being actually cooks its own food. No animal on this planet has ever cooked its own food, unless they fell into a geyser or a volcano. So the point is that mankind has the willful power, which is called the power of chemistry, which for our edification of students these days, you would say start with the table of elements. Now that's a rather crude term to use from a standpoint now in terms of defining science. But what it means essentially is that mankind has increased its power over what we call the elements of the chemistry table. That's a simplistic version of it today. It has much higher implications than it ever had in the 19th century. That we use the principle of chemistry to give mankind per capita and per unit of action an agreed power to increase man's power in and over society, not as people, but over the territory of society. We not only cook our food, we go to higher levels of the use of fire. We stop burning wood. We burn charcoal. We burn coal. We discover chemical elements which enhance the whole process of making the tools and the things which are necessary for mankind to progress. No animal does that. Mankind is the only species that can do it. Now, this means that that the principle of fire as such, the blank idea of fire, is not science. It does not give you any means for mankind's progress. It's the development of discoveries, which we call the discovery of principles of chemistry, for example, which is a convenient categorical term, baggage, throw all the things into it. And similar things. We're now going to thermonuclear fusion. Now, thermonuclear fusion means chemistry as we used to define it doesn't mean anything anymore. And we're going into other things beyond that, beyond what we call this kind of higher chemistry. Mankind now has a degree of power, to begin to control development on the moon, to begin to move out and defend Earth against the threats from asteroids. All those powers are now coming to us. So mankind, and also we have powers increase of productivity. We have power to increase the productivity of the human being per capita at a rate which has never existed in human existence before. We have that in progress available to us now. We merely have to breed and train the younger people coming up to acquire these cognitive skills. And the skills are cognitive ones. They are not practical ones. They are discoveries. They're not mechanics. They're discoveries. Like Archimedes was only a mechanic. Aristophanes was a scientist. That's the difference. And Archimedes gets all the population. He committed no science. He couldn't even solve the problem of simple circles. But we had the other hand. We had a discoverer of principles which defined the entirety of the principles of modern science. So our problem is we've got to realize that the green policies, the zero growth policy, is actually a swindle by brainwashed people who follow the doctrine dictated to them by idiots who are sometimes called college professors, who are called politicians. They're all idiots. Their thinking has no correspondence to the human principle. They call themselves practical because they can't think.
All right. Well, this will be the last question for the evening. And it continues the theme you just brought up. You had mentioned about fracking versus nuclear power, that the only reason, if we had nuclear power, would anyone consider fracking? It's kind of silly. So, at your direction, an educational program has been instituted and is taking form, Lynn, to bring those less familiar with your thinking up to speed. It's taken the form of discussions and planned presentations on economics, on global water flows, on the science and promise of fusion, on its suppression, and on that great habilitation dissertation of Bernard Riemann, which you have said has shaped much of your thinking. One particular theme that came up recently in this educational process are the concepts of energy flux density and the difficulty of understanding it as opposed to economic activity or capital intensity. So I can give two examples. On one homework assignment on capital intensity, somebody wrote that, quote, an increase in capital intensity is the increase in the amount of work that goes into your entire production process by society as a whole. Now, there's more to it. Increasing production, for example, if everyone worked 2 more hours a day, at least with productive jobs, that would increase economic activity, but it wouldn't change capital intensity, which is a measure of how much investment goes into making the production possible. How much is invested per laborer. For example, investing in large amounts of machinery or infrastructure can allow a more efficient production technique, which, despite requiring all those inputs, is actually cheaper. That's economy. On the other side, on energy flux density, and the challenge to the students to think of an energy flux density increase that was not usable because of a lack of capital intensity, someone said, well, the Soviet Union, where there was a military science driver that developed processes of higher energy flux density, but the civilian economy had no capital intensity to make it possible to be implemented. So these questions are generating a fair amount of difficulty, so I'd like to ask on behalf of these activist students of your work, could you please clarify what's energy flux density, and why must an economist understand this concept?
Well, it actually means, that if you take the velocity, the speed of light, and the question is how many rotations do you get, vibrations do you get, in terms of a unit of the speed of light, and you find that the greater the intensity of the frequency, is otherwise identified, the increase of the frequency in broad terms, without going into some kind of recipe, but in broad terms it means that the increase of the density of power, the density of action. So the density of action determines the potential productive powers of labor. That as mankind has to depend on how can we generate and control increases in the energy flux density. Now, now thermonuclear power is a standard today of the kind of general policy for the United States, which the United States requires if it's going to continue to exist. Today, because of the Zeusian factor of corruption, which has destroyed the mental processes of so many of our citizens, particularly the recent the two generations that have just come through as new generations. The 2 new generations have reached a level of degeneration in intellectual capabilities and moral conditions that they don't exist. That's why the drug policy, that's why the drug usage, that's why the education systems in schools is actually murderous and treasonous. What's being taught, the way they're being taught, is treasonous, because you're destroying the population of the people of the United States. You have, for example, 2 terrible sets of office. We have the Bush-Cheney administration, all right? There you have 8 years, 2 terms. You have the Obama administration, about 6 years now, right? Now, how many generations, what age group does that represent? That means that most of the young people reaching the age of about 18 today are mentally incompetent. They are not capable of eating their own food. Therefore, they take other substitutes. which they either smoke or suck or something instead. Why do people live and go out on marijuana? Because they're morally dead. Because mankind depends upon mankind's progress, historical progress, in increasing the productive powers of labor. This is not merely a performance stunt. This is the inherent destiny of mankind. When mankind does not progress, mankind is dying. The human species is rotting. And therefore, the increase of energy flux density, which now goes beyond thermonuclear fusion. And if you cannot apply thermonuclear fusion, which is virtually prohibited in the United States since the end of the beginning of the 1920s, everything in the direction of progress, especially the progress associated with the administration of Kennedy, everything has been turned down. There has been no net actual progress in the economy of the United States since the assassination of President John F. Kennedy. And that was the reason why he was assassinated, because the British Empire found out that he was a clever fellow who could get things done, that he was in the Eleanor Roosevelt tradition of Franklin Roosevelt. It was Eleanor Roosevelt who created his candidacy for president out of the Senate. So he was killed. He was murdered by circles who I know. I know the interests involved. And that's exactly the problem we have. We have to understand that if we are going to be truly Americans, and if the United States is going to exist, continue to exist, we have to get rid of Wall Street. It's the first thing. Now, that's a simple thing to do. It's already bankrupt. All we have to do is put in Glass-Steagall again. Now, the Glass-Steagall is an imperfect tool, but it's not imperfect if it has also the accompanying requirements. Yeah? We could, by restoring a Glass-Steagall system now, which could be done on any proper election day of a national election. Any national election could vote in Glass-Steagall. Now that would mean that what the effect would that be would Wall Street would be virtually shut down because it could not meet the standard of a Glass-Steagall system. So what? Get rid of Wall Street. Who needs it? For example, take the banks, some of the banks that are part of Wall Street. You don't have to shut down all the banks. What you have to do is shut on the parts of the banks which do not conform to the U.S. Constitution. In that case, then the banks which have assets in them, which are not Wall Street type assets, well, we have to save them. How do we do that? Well, United States way. The Treasury Secretary of the United States sets up a system of auditing and says that any banking system of any type that will meet the standards of American banking, we will help to rescue, to solve their problems, and to try to maintain the worthy assets within the processes of those banking institutions. That reform. Then we have to have another thing. We don't have any technology, or we're destroying it. So therefore we need a new basis. In addition to that banking system, we need to get, first of all, federal credit to go with the reform in the banking system. So the federal government will have to commit itself to supply credit to all worthy borrowers and the banking institutions they're associated with, or investments. We also have to create a pool of investment for the high technology development, like thermonuclear fusion. So these elements combined around the Glass-Steagall, and going back and recognizing that we in the United States cancel states' rights, economic states' rights. The states, as composed of people, have sovereignty relative on a state level. But the financial operations of the nation, the economic operations of the nations, are under the control of the presidency of the United States and the association institutions of the presidency. And the Congress has only the right to regulate as a total the way in which the procedures are set up under law to set these things into motion. So there is actually a relatively simple solution in terms of type to save the United States now. Get rid of this president. Go back to the Glass-Steagall system. And we in the United States, under our presidents, if we get a competent one, or the competently staffed, we can begin to rebuild the United States right now. So the issue is, again, the enemy within us, the British enemy within us, the Wall Street enemy, which is British, within us. This is Satan. Well, we don't believe in killing people, but killing Satan, that's a free shot.
Okay, on that note, I think that's going to bring a conclusion to our broadcast for tonight. So thank you very much, Lynn, and thanks for joining us here, Jason. Thank you for tuning in. Good night.